Hi, everybody. Welcome to the June Art Talk at the Sasse Museum of Art. And today we're going to be featuring Stephen Rudin. And I'm going to ask him some questions, but I hope you ask him some questions too as we go on. Fascinating person. I've gotten to know over a couple of pre-interviews, and I'm just fascinated by what he does and who he is. And we were talking before the recording started, he's kind of this guy who does a lot of different things. You know, he's part of New York City's environmental program. I don't know how to say that because I just found out about it. He's also a psychiatrist and an artist, a collage artist. And the collage art that he does is absolutely fascinating. You know, I've done, like all kids have done in school, I do the collage, and I never realized how freeing it can kind of be, and how much of an exploration of the psyche it can be, and of society. And that's what he's doing. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jean, for having me. I usually sort of introduce myself by saying that I am a visual artist, teacher, and psychiatrist, and I'm based in New York City, and that my work serves as research for a greater philosophy about art and creativity and emotional resilience. And for the past decade or so, I've been focused on collage, and we're going to talk about this. I have a sort of a philosophy called the psychology of collage, and it's exploring collage as a metaphor for memory and identity.
Now, you said some really interesting things about memory and the way we can kind of get stuck in a notion of the past, and collage kind of frees you. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
So one of the things that I think about when I think about collage is that we're working with items oftentimes that already exist. So, and a lot of times actually when I hear many artists' talks, they often describe that their work has to do with memory. So, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find an artist that actually doesn't have something to do with memory. In fact, when I listen to some of the art talks that you've done, a lot of times the artists talk about how it sort of ideas about childhood sort of scintillate to the surface and it comes out in their work. And collage even more so, because collage has to do with, like, essentially you're taking an archive. In my case, I'm taking an archive that already exists and I'm making a new story out of it. And so, and basically, so when I talk about, when you just described that idea about memories being fixed, is that memories are actually not fixed. And a lot of neuroscientific research suggests that memories are constantly changing. And we can pretty much appreciate that, a lot of us, when we think about something, that every time we think about something that it's slightly different, that some elements of the memory, you know, are apparent, other elements of the memory are not as apparent. Sometimes we say, oh, wait, that couldn't have happened because we were in Florida at the time. So we sometimes conflate memories. So my work actually has to do with the idea that memories are always changing. We could talk more about that also.
Yeah, and identities, I wonder if you agree that identities can and should change.
So one of the things about, you know, a sort of a conceptualization about memory is that all of our memories together, there are many different ways in which to think about identity. But one of the ways to think about identity is sort of like, who am I? And basically, when you think of when you say to somebody, who am I? What they're going to do is they're going to go into a reservoir of their memories. Now, their memories are going to be various different kinds of memories. Like they're going to remember where they were born. So that might be a memory that is like a memory of fact. And then they're going to put together memories of experiences. But the idea over time is that if memories are the building blocks of identity, and memories are always changing, identity is always changing as well. And we can also all relate to that idea. I say that the way that it relates to me as a person is that I used to say that I was a psychiatrist and an artist. And now I say that I'm an artist and a psychiatrist. So I'm still the same person, just the parts are rearranged in a slightly different way. From the outside, it looks different, but I'm made up of these parts. So I think about this over the lifespan, is that our roles are also sort of constantly changing. So when we're young and we put layers and layers and layers, that our identity actually changes over time based on sort of the interplay of the parts.
And okay, that's great. So it sounds like what should happen, what was healthy for people, right?
Well, yeah, and you're getting at this idea of, which is like, that when I say a lot of times that my work serves as research for a greater philosophy about creativity and emotional resilience, I think about the definition of creativity. And so one of the things about creativity is that it's new. New is one of the key words with creativity, is that people sometimes describe creativity as a non-linear process that sidesteps traditional ways of thinking, seeing, and doing. But the real crux of it is newness, is about sort of changing it up. And I think of collage as its own creative process that also shows us how we can take what already exists in the world and we can create something new. And many of the innovations that we all, value have to do with somebody taking something that already exists, sort of recollaging it and coming up with something new.
That's great. Okay, so I think it would be a good idea to take a look at this, at the catalog that Gene's put together for this. And it's interesting, you're going to see an image on the left and the image on the right, and there's a pattern to it. What if we could talk about that pattern a little bit? Okay, so here, everybody can see this? Okay, so the what we have is something on the left and something on the right. Both are really interesting. Could you describe what's on the left?
So when Gene put this catalog together, so my whole concept is this also, I'll just sort of back up a little bit. I always give like a little bit of background. And one of the ideas is that when I talk about the psychology of collage and the psychology of memory, I also think about this idea that we all live in the world, right? And we might go along, we might be raised in the same family, we might go to the same parties, we might go to the same schools, we might go to the same events, and we select different parts of those events. And basically there are certain parts that we select and there are certain parts that we ignore. So you might go to a party with a friend and then afterwards another friend will say, I missed the party, tell me what happened. And then the friend describes it and it's like you were both at the same party, but the way that the person describes their experience at the party, it seems like it's a different party because they selected they talked about the music and the food, and you talked about what the people were wearing and the chandeliers. So we're going through life, we're collecting all of these parts. And a lot of times we don't pay attention to the parts that we ignore. And a lot of times we're primed in some ways in our childhood to pay attention to certain parts over other parts. So what you're looking at is basically are two different sides of the coin. So on the left side are the parts that I usually don't use. They're the parts that I disregard. And on the right side, which I think of as sort of the main event, are the parts that I'm gravitated toward. But one of the things I value is I say that what we throw out sometimes is just as important as what we keep, that the parts of ourselves that we like to disregard sometimes are the most valuable, and sometimes the leftovers are the main event. So on the right side is really the part of the collage that I'm most known for. It's a figurative collage. This is about 100 pieces, about 32 by 40 inches, and it's made by magazines and catalog clippings, but I save the remnants. And when I save the remnants, during the pandemic, I looked at this box of remnants, and at that time, I decided to work with the remnants. So what you're gonna see on the left are the remnants, and on the right is sort of the main event. But it sort of turns on its head the idea of like, what is the trash and what is the treasure? And of course, collage also plays with that in general about the idea of what is trash and what is treasure. So what you're looking at on the left are the parts that I normally would disregard. Those are sort of the trash, the excess. Those are the parts round. And on the right is sort of the main event. But some people think that the left is the main event and that the right, so I'm sort of playing with that idea.
Now, you mentioned magazines and catalog, and I know there's been a shift in your work, but magazines and catalog formed a really important part of your identity at the time you were doing this, or at least of your intellectual life, I should say.
So I'm the ultimate archivist. Basically I have been making scrapbooks for when I was introduced to the idea of a scrapbook when I was like in 5th grade, it sort of rocked my world. And I clipped things out, and I've always been, I was always collecting tickets. I've been interested in this archive, this autobiographical archive. And alongside that, I've been collecting magazines. And for me, magazines really held a lot of value. At the time, like when I was a child, magazines weren't as readily as available as they were, let's say 10 years ago. We're going toward a period where actually magazines are not available anymore. But the sort of golden age of magazines was, I think about, and print media and magazines. So magazines played a really important role. And I have magazines from like 30 years ago that I've collected, that I've moved with 5 or 6 times. And so basically, so this idea of archiving my history, including my family photos, I've always been the person who made my family photos, et cetera. So the magazines basically are also representative of a particular time in my life because they represent when I got them. A lot of times people would give me the magazine so that it would represent the relationship that I had with the person, or I would pick up a magazine, a free magazine on a vacation or something like that. And so basically they became like these almost like transitional objects throughout my life where the magazine held specific value. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that I really started making collage, and I started making it out of the magazines from my waiting room in my office, my psychiatry practice, that I just couldn't throw the magazines out. So I started snipping them together and making, so magazines, like, there are many different levels of meaning for magazines for me, but both a window into the outside world. It was before the internet, so we couldn't see a lot of the things. In many ways, magazines were what we relied on to see, to be able to see something over and over and over again. That's another aspect of it. Like with a television program, you see it, it's gone. But with a magazine, you can continually return to it years. So magazines play a lot of important role in my life.
That's great. Let's check out another one of these. There's a few things that strike me about all your images. Your pathways up, the overwhelmingly powerful part that nature plays in so many of them. You have repeated animals like dogs and horses. Are these just things that you like, or are they symbolic of something, or how are you using them?
Well, what I realize also, the more that I do collage, is that, people talk about art as a language. And I think of art actually as more of a mode of communication. In other words, that it's not just a language. In other words, like body movement is, I wouldn't say that body movement or body gestures were just a language. You'd say it was maybe a mode of communication. So language is a mode of communication, and art is a mode of communication that does also use language. So then I think of actually that collage is my specific dialect, or is the language of choice. And within collage, there are certain, like, just like I use the word basically way too much, I use certain symbols over and over and over again in order to express sort of my characteristic idea. So the words that I use most often are dogs and flowers and plants and horses and raccoons and birds and curtains and clouds and stairwells and thresholds and doorways and gates and water. So that's sort of the language that I use. So if you were to basically say, you speak English and I speak English, but if you really were to think about the words that we use most often, the words that I use most often are these symbols. And so even just to peel it back even a layer more, then I think to myself, well, why do I use these symbols? And I realized, like, so I'm not the kind, my art process is very much about the idea that the art speaks back to me. So in other words, that it's almost like a projection of my unconscious, that I create something and then later on it tells me something. So one of the things that it tells me, obviously, when I look at the language that I use, is that I really value something that's called biophilia. And I didn't really understand what biophilic design was until I had to give a talk about it, but it's about the idea, it's like life-loving design. So that's why I also have open spaces and pathways, both places to expand and places to hide, and then also like the use of colors and foliage and flowing and the 5 elements in air. So basically, so I'm really interested, I really, really highly value nature and, our relationship with nature, animals, and, the like.
That's interesting. So it's filled with life more than anything else. That's really the focus of that. That's fascinating. Okay. What is the one on the right here?
The chakras, the one on the right?
Yeah.
So, I think a lot of times basically about this idea of self-actualization. And then just recently, I'd say that my artwork actually is both a doorway or a foray into inquiry, as well as a window into my, what I value and what I think about. So one of the things that actually that every time I, do a piece of a work of art, like these ideas come up. Like, for example, like recently I was thinking about like, what is beauty? And, there's a whole philosophy on what is beauty. In other words, by Hume and other philosophers, there's a whole world out there about what is beauty. So, and then so one of the things I realized is that I was talking about, I've been interested in this idea of the chakras, which is about self-actualization. And it's about the idea that like you go up and down a continuum. And you basically, with the chakras, just as a basic idea, is that you start with the root chakra, which is the earth, and you go up to the third eye chakra, which basically becomes, the eye to intuition, or you can go down. You could start with intuition and make something concrete. But now I realize there's this idea that's called self-transcendence, which is a whole new concept, which is about the idea of like essentially connecting to something greater than yourself and realizing that you're part of a greater community. So I think that in some ways, these works have to do both with self-actualization, which is the idea of like going from something concrete to something spiritual, and then going from spiritual to something concrete, and also the idea of being connected to a greater a greater world and a greater community.
It's kind of Maslow meets Frankel.
Yes, it is. It is. That's, yeah, everything is collage. So as we talk for the next like 40 minutes, you're going to realize how much why I think about the idea that collage is a metaphor for memory and identity in the way that we think, because everything, I'm putting together all these parts from all these different theories. And I think that's what we all do. So, and I think that basically sometimes we don't make enough space in our existing framework to allow new pieces to change the framework. That's sort of the idea behind constructive learning. And like I said, every time I do a talk, or like I did a talk recently at Columbia University, was all about research and collage. And I was talking about the idea that when you write a research paper, you do sort of the same thing. You collect all these bits and pieces, you put them together in various different ways, and then it comes out as something new.
Interesting. Take a look at here. I really love the accidental data and the idea of accidental dataism. And you've got the image right here. What do you mean by accidental data?
So as a collage artist, for like the past 10 years, people often say to me, data. They would say, oh, data. And I thought to myself, well, I did read about data when I was studying for the SAT. I remember there was a passage. There was a reading comprehension passage, and I think I got every question wrong. I just couldn't understand it. It was so, but that's the purpose. That's the whole thing about data, is that it's not supposed to be understood. The minute you think you understand data, you don't understand data anymore. You have to understand that understanding data is not understanding it. So the other idea behind data is that data embraces the idea of the accident. So I didn't realize, so during the pandemic, I had a lot of time to obviously reflect in ways that I hadn't historically. And I was getting more interested in data. And there's a lot of parallels between the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, not to mention, the Spanish flu, and then of course the COVID-19 pandemic. And nonetheless, and then basically the technological innovations at the time, the internet versus, the beginning of the, technological age. Anyway, so I was interested a lot in this idea of data. And then what I did was, these pieces on the left are basically the newspapers that I use to line my studio and to clean my brushes, because I don't like to send, I don't send any paint down the drain. So I make these sort of like, just sort of clean the brush off. And I've been interested in this idea of like making accidental art for a really long time, but these are actually the COVID newspapers. So these newspapers, underneath all this paint, is all the COVID headlines. And so basically it was a way of like immersing myself in what was going on, but also having the safety of my own art practice and my own studio in order to explore it. And so these are actually collage. So these are not just, the newspapers, but these are the newspapers cut up and then reconfigured. And it wasn't until afterwards I said, oh, well, this is data. So I realized in order to make data, it has, for me, at least, it has to be by accident. And it has a lot of the same feelings that the original data had to do. And it's made from newspapers, which obviously there's an allusion to data there, because data was, they used a lot of newspapers in data too. So anyway, so that's what the accidental data, and like when I make a series, I make a lot of them. So the ones on the ones that we saw on the other series, which are those abstract ones, I've made hundreds of those. These I've made about 30 of them. These are 16 by 20 each. But anyway, that's what that series is about.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, and it also brings up the question that I think all artists could be asked at this point. Like, how has COVID affected your art practice?
Well, it's in the beginning. So if you want to go backwards, actually, go backwards in the catalog, so these pieces on the left, these pieces, the ones that are these abstract pieces, which I call back to basics. So when you can see that my work, my figurative work, is very involved, and it requires a lot of it almost requires math skills, because I am trying to create a scene that looks very deep, that has very deep perspective, and the pieces are chosen very carefully, and it's very methodically, and it's done in a certain frame of mind. In other words, in sort of an agitated state, or a saddened mourning state, this kind of work was very hard to do. So during the beginning of the pandemic, I thought to myself, well, I really knew that making art was really important, at least for me. And I said, well, I need to go back to basics. I need to just go back to colors, lines, and shapes. And I also needed to look for beauty in unexpected places. In all the places that I was looking for beauty, I wasn't finding it. You're not, like in other words, a lot of my work is based on media. When you were reading any of the media, basically for the first year of the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of beauty in the media, and of course there wasn't a lot of happiness for good reason. So I created these pieces on the left actually as a way of creating light in my life. I said, everything I'm seeing around me is really bringing me down. And if I'm ever going to be useful in any way, I need to keep my spirits up. So these works basically were born from that. So I call that back to basics, which were just on the right. It's very complex. It's much in the language part of the brain. It's about this complex story. And on the left, it's really just it's just the sheer feeling of colors, lines, and shapes, and the fact that this tells a story, even though it's not a conscious story, it's not a link, it's not a story that's based on any specific, but it does give me a feeling, and it does, believe it or not, it does bring me back to like 80s and childhood, which a lot of our artists do. We could just peel back the layer and just go in a time warp right back to childhood. I feel a lot of artists can do that.
Yeah, and it has sort of the feeling of the stuff that Monet was doing toward the end of his life too, right? Where he's cutting out those big shapes and arranging and rearranging, just doing really beautiful work.
Yes, and Matisse, the Matisse cutouts, when I heard the story of Matisse, I really, that story has really stuck with me for a really long time. I learned the story of the Matisse cutouts when I was in medical school in the mid 90s, and about the idea that Matisse had basically really had survived a very significant health problem, and basically he survived, and he couldn't do what he was able to do before. He couldn't do the kinds of paintings that he was able to do before, and so what he was able to do was cut out pieces of paper, and then his assistants would pin them on the wall. And then and so I realized that basically that was a real story of triumph and perseverance, that over the course of our lives, unfortunately, there is a lot of loss. And so one of the things that I try to think about is about working with limitation, and about the idea of how does somebody, how do you work with one arm tied behind your back? So I really am inspired by that story of Matisse and the cutouts. And that's something that's definitely part of my work.
Well, yeah, that's interesting you bring up loss, because you said that there are good loss and there are bad loss, and nostalgia being kind of a positive loss. And so we've got nostalgia built into your work in a lot of this. So
yeah, so we're alluding a lot to our, John and I had really good conversations before this, where we really got deep. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, so when people look at my work, they often say that it's very nostalgic. And of course, when we look at media, all of us, one of the things I'm interested in is how we intersperse media into our own stories. In other words, that I could grow up on the opposite side of the world as somebody else. And if we consume the same media, in some ways we have that same layer in our memory. So we share that collective memory of media. And so obviously, so since collage, I use a lot of things from the past and I intersperse them in the present, and because I believe that everything in the present obviously still has remnants of the past in it. And so one of the things I've thought about as a psychiatrist over the years is that nostalgia is one of the few emotions that's related to loss that's not just negative. So when people are nostalgic, they think about a time that never will be again, but yet there's some sort of a positive feeling toward it. In other words, oh, those were good times, even though we know that will never happen again. We'll never be a 14-year-old, on the swim team again, with the, liberation that we had, but yet we can still feel that loss and we can feel a sense of positivity toward it. So I feel like nostalgia is one of those feelings in which you can work through loss, but in a positive way.
Yeah, and I can see some nostalgia here too. I mean, you've got these images from a previous time, and you're kind of incorporating them into the architecture of the present. I love this, the effect of this long hallway here too. That's really fascinating.
So I often, I think sometimes, people say, well, where do you get your inspiration from? I do get them a lot from dreams. And in my dreams, I'm often it's not such a coincidence. I'm often carrying a lot of, packed a lot of stuff. I mean, I've been known, I can carry a lot. As a collage artist, you really, you know how to pack it in. It's not a minimalist art form. It's very heavy, especially collecting all those magazines. So a lot of, I really actually think of the idea of like transitional spaces and doorways and as meaningful, and also about like almost celebrating that idea, like, that idea that like that transitional and that being in transition. A lot of times, I used to say, I don't do well with transitions, but then I think to myself, actually, some of my most exciting times have been during transitions. It's just a way of, so I think that a lot of times people do view the idea of a transition and transitional spaces negatively, but I also think that like that life is a transitional, and that we want to embrace that, that a lot of times also, like I think about when I teach my class, is that a lot of times students want to be finished with the work before they start the work. I say we don't really want to be finished before we start, that basically that the joy that comes from creating art is in the process, that once we create something, we just move on to the next one. So really, so I do have a lot of spaces to move around, in my work, with that idea in mind.
All right, let's take a look at some more here. Oh, that's interesting. Now, okay, so this image right here, that's you. Is that correct?
That is me. This work is called photobomb because I'm actually photobombing the collage. Photobomb is when you jump into somebody's photograph. So I'm photobombing the collage. I'm in obviously all of the collages in some way, shape, or form, but sometimes I hide myself in them. And also this collage also has to do with the idea of art as a place and like a home. I often use home as a metaphor and as a theme in my work. So you'll see a lot of home, like people will write to me and they'll say, that's the place I want to be. I'll say, exactly, that's what I want. I want to create a place that you want to hang out, that you feel at home with. There's obviously a lot going on in this scene. You can't see so much with this, but the piano is on fire. There's there is a fire coming out of the piano. There's also lots of, I also like the idea that when you look at my work, that you almost like a dream where like I used to have these dreams. I was living in this really small apartment, that there was this hidden door and then there was a huge room behind there that I never found before. I'm always playing with that idea that there's more and more and more and more, because I just think that idea is sort of exciting. And the other thing is that I want people to continue to return to the work. Sometimes, I'm interested in this idea of creative process. I'm interested in this concept of like, when do you know when your work is done? And I think that when my work is, I know when it's done, when I come back to it over and over again, and I want to spend time with it. In other words, when I just want to put it away, I realize I'm not done. But if I want to spend time with it, I feel that it's done.
And so, yeah, it does look like a place you want to live. You've got the hokusai here, and you've got the chandelier, and you've got again the dog. It's really okay. So you've got. I wonder if this is intentional. You've got Hokusai's discussion of tidal waves and the history of Japan here, and a fire over here. So you've got the two elements going in both destructive ways.
Yes. And so, one of the concepts like that, that a lot of us struggle with is the idea that, that we put these connotations on, that we, first of all, that we have a lot of difficulty accepting that life is a mixed bag, that people are a mixed bag, that maybe some of our greatest attributes come from the idea that we're fiery and we can be destructive, and some of our, so the idea is that basically that life is a mixed bag, that there's always tensions going on, and that it's really the gestalt and the heart and basically the totality of things that we really, so that I feel that I would like to pay attention to more myself, because I also, one of the reasons why I also create so much depth in the work is because I want to show that the relation of the viewer to the scene makes a big difference. That oftentimes when we look at our lives, we might be like right at the tidal wave, just looking at the tidal wave. And then somebody says, well, let's zoom back a little bit. Let's step back a little bit. Let's step back a little bit. Let's step back. Now what do you see? And then when you step back from very far away, you say, oh, I see a scene that looks very homey. Obviously, there's a lot going on in it, but it's all about the idea of like where you're standing, and I try to do that myself too. I can't underestimate the idea of the power of perspective, both in my life and in just, in recommend that other people think about that concept too, because we often get really, really too close to a subject matter when we need to step back from it.
That reminds me very much of what Bruegel's doing with the fall of Icarus, right? And Icarus is off in a corner, and all the rest of the life is going on around him. So you can step back a little bit, you can see how it's just part of everything. not everything itself. So let's take a look at this one. Ah, Bar Mitzvah Noir. That's fantastic. Are you in this one as well?
This is my stepfather here in the middle, this very handsomely dressed fellow, and basically, he was just written up in a journal as a very handsomely, elegantly dressed fellow, and I think he is there too. And so a lot of times my work does start with my own family as inspiration, sort of as the sort of the nidus or the focus, and then I expand outward. And so but this is about the idea also that it's about the idea, when I say that collage is a metaphor for memories, that notice that if you were in this scene, for example, you would not necessarily be able to see everything that was going on. But if you had a memory of this scene, like it was your bar mitzvah, you might remember that there were people, checking their coats in the back room, and there were people that were from out of town waiting in this lobby, and there were people coming from far away. And, you might remember, and you layer these things all together. That's why I think that photographs are just a part of a memory. Movies get closer to a memory, but I feel like collage is actually a really good way of characterizing that. Like when you remember, for example, your bar mitzvah, you remember all of these different things sort of layered together into one cohesive scene. And so that's what this piece is about. It's about the idea that multiple things are going on at the same time, and that how would you remember those scenes? How would you navigate that in your mind?
And it's through fragment. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. And I've been ignoring, not intentionally, the images on the left.
So the images on the left, like I talk about one time I said, like, if you could express, like you say to somebody, how are you feeling today? Sometimes that's sort of a difficult concept. How are you feeling today? But if you could make an abstract collage and you say, this is how I'm feeling today. You say, oh, I understand how you're feeling today. Now, this reminds me, this for some reason gives me a very French feeling. That's why I called it the Can series, because it has a very French feeling toward me or to me. And afterwards, I feel like it actually most resembles, sort of like this French surrealism, maybe early 20th century, maybe even a little bit Cubism, Art Deco. But it's basically, and it was made, like I said, when I talk about the idea that I don't prospectively decide what the topic is, but afterwards I realized that I was making this work around the same time that I started to really immerse myself in learning about Dada and surrealism. And just as a spoiler alert, that there is a connection between psychiatry and Dada and surrealism, that the Dada artists were paying attention to the to the advances in psychoanalysis at the time, and the surrealists as well. And they have, there's a reciprocal influence. But I'm in the process of sort of studying that. But that's what that work on the left is sort of represents.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'm going to take it off the sharing here for a second, just to find out if what I want to open up for. I certainly have more questions for Dave. For Stephen. But does anybody else have questions? Give you a moment here. Yeah, Mandy.
Yeah, Stephen, you use collage in your own work as self-expression. Do you have your clients or patients use it also?
That's a really good question. So I don't see patients anymore. I've been full-time artist for the past 5 years, but I am interested in the idea of, I have been doing a lot of research in terms of, and there is some research in terms of using collage as a psychology or as a psychotherapy modality. I'm definitely interested in that, and I think that there is something to it, but it's definitely a work in progress and something that I'm going to be doing more research and thought about.
And Jenny Bates says, I don't have a question, but I would like to say that I really enjoyed the series of collages that were on the left. So these abstract collages, I agree, Jenny Bate. I'm not sure how to say your name. Absolutely, I love them. What other questions do we have?
I'll pop in if that's okay.
Great.
Stephen, you are such a cool guy. Wow.
Oh, thank you.
Love hearing you talk about this. And I'm curious, is your home as vibrant and interesting as the images on the right, or is it more on the left? Because my studio is kind of on the left, but my house is like, oh. So in your personal life, are you like that at all?
Let me think about it. Well, I definitely pack a lot of stuff, so basically like, I could, like I said, I could pack a 2-bedroom apartment into a studio. So I definitely, in terms of, there's a neatness in terms of like, I think that actually, to sort of think a little bit more about your idea, is that I've lived in New York City a really long time, and I've lived in a lot of small places, and people often would ask me earlier on, to see what I could do with the space. And they would say, can you do that for my space? And I would be able to like, so I'm very good with space. In other words, I could make, like I said, I could make a 2-bedroom apartment out of a studio by so I have that sort of spatial relationship, I think, and I think some of that spatial relationship on the right side, which is that figurative collage, has to do with the idea that I could actually like make something look much bigger than it actually is. I do have that that skill. I'm very, I can pack, a month's worth of stuff. I'm very good at being able to, so I have a very good spatial sense. But in terms of the maximalism, I sort of, I'm not as, it's funny because people sometimes think like, they look at the work and it's very luxurious, and it's very opulent. And actually I'm not like that really at all. That's just my fantasy. It's just, I actually, at some point in my life, I said, instead of creating those kinds of opulent spaces, I was just going to create fictional ones that were 2D that I could, just slide underneath, put on a shelf.
Yeah, it's funny coming from New York City. You say a tiny place, but your pictures are of mansions and really huge things.
Yeah, like I said, I think I asked people in New York City whether or not they've ever had the dream that there was another huge room that they hadn't ever discovered in their apartment. And a lot of people have that dream. It's a funny dream, there's a dream of your teeth falling out or what, but there is a dream in New York City that there's an extra room that you don't know about. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's here. Like think about, because, we all live in these tiny little places.
That's funny. Who else has a question? Well, I think I'm going to ask a kind of process question, because we talked about that a little bit. And the idea of observation, deconstruction, rehearsal, and assembly refinement. I wonder if you could explain that.
So so people sometimes ask me how I create the work. And so I have a process which I'm always operationalizing everything. I was Mandy asked whether or not you use, I use it, if I've ever used it with clients before. I'm always thinking about all these manuals, because I was a cognitive behavioral therapist, and in cognitive behavioral therapy, we often have these manuals. So basically, we work from these manuals. So I'm always thinking about operationalizing something. So I've operationalized my my method, and because what I did was, I did it for a really long time, and then I thought about, well, what am I actually doing? So I call it ODRA-R: observation, deconstruction, rehearsal, assembly, refinement. So basically, the first thing I do is I observe thousands and thousands of images, and I'm really paying attention to things in the world. And I really, I spend a lot of time in that observational phase. I'm very much like a person who lays down and thinks about what I saw over the day, or, really, and I take millions of pictures, and I'm constantly observing. And then the second step I do is I start to deconstruct the images, which basically means cut them out. So when I cut them out, then I think about everything from here to Timbuktu. I think about the meaning of life. I think about the method itself. I think about I find that deconstructive phase is very meditative. And I also get to study the images when I cut them out, because I cut them out extremely precisely. And I almost like carve them out. So people ask, well, when do you cut them out? I say, I don't just cut a straight line. I cut it out like almost if you were carving a lump of clay or a lump of marble, and then I just go closer and closer and closer and closer in. So then I'd be able to follow the lines. And then I make these decisions along the way, like, do I want that? Do I not want that? And I also make a decision that I decide that I want to take risks there. In other words, one of the things I notice a lot of times when students are making collage is that they don't want to cut their materials up, because they're just, the compositions are really perfect. And then I think to myself, well, that's the whole purpose, is to try to deconstruct it. So I basically deconstruct it, and I deconstruct the elements. I cut out the shadows. I have a way of basically deconstructing the images, but I also try to cut out more than less. So I try to basically reduce it to its most elemental. And so when I deconstruct it, I realize, like, as I'm seeing something like this, I say, oh, I saw a staircase like 2 years ago. Where did I put that? That's why I also say that my work has to do with memory, is because it requires a lot of memory. Like, where did I put it? When did I see that? I mean, you could think I have thousands and thousands of images, and I have to find one and think that so I'm actually, as I'm cutting them out, I'm actually memorizing the images as well. So, but that's not to say that I don't come across a stack of images that I've cut out like 2 years ago, and I say, oh yeah, I don't even remember cutting that out. So I'm cutting them out, I deconstruct them, and then I start to think about different configurations of the images, almost like a puzzle that's floating around in my head with all of these. And what I call about the rehearsal phase, which is the third phase, is I start to lay the pieces out between each other. And then I leave them, and it takes me sometimes up to 2 years to finish a piece. So it takes a really long time to finish a piece. I don't often tell people who take my courses, like they say, how long does it take? I say it takes a while, because the course doesn't take 2 years. So, but not every piece takes 2 years. And also the other idea is that I have pieces that I do more quickly. I have pieces because I want to keep it's like I'm cross training. So so what I do is I leave them unglued on, almost like cookie sheets. I have this table that I pull them out of. I leave them unglued, and then I pull them out and I say, oh, that needs a little tweak, that needs a little tweak. And sometimes I hit them with my hip, and then I don't fix it right away. I say, oh, maybe that's better. And then I notice new juxtaposition. I think about that in our mental life. In other words, like, think about the idea, you go along, you got this collage in your head, and something happens to you, it pushes things out of whack. Do you put it back in whack right away, or do you say, oh, maybe there's something interesting about the way that those pieces laid out? In other words, maybe I don't have to put it exactly back to the way that it was before. Maybe I can use this experience of being sort of jolted in one way or another to realize that maybe that piece, in other words, sometimes in life, we want to re-examine the contextual relationship between the pieces. Sometimes something in our life causes that piece to get out of whack. Don't put it back in place so quickly. Think about, oh, well, maybe there's something there. So I pay attention to that. That's where I think the data comes in, and the chance, and the absurdism of life, that sometimes things in life happen, and it's just like, that's why the pieces arranged in the way that they did. Go with it. So anyway, so I allow that, and then I purposely don't glue them down for a very long time. When I say the rehearsal, I rehearse this configuration, I rehearse this configuration, and then I tell the story over and over and over again. I move this down, I move it in, move it in, move it. And they're like almost like a stage set, like a diorama, almost like a psychodrama, where it's like in and out. Sometimes it starts with me, I pull myself out of it, I put myself in. Anyway, it's a lot of movement is going on in the work. And then eventually I glue it down, which is I call the assembly phase. But then I always leave room to refine it. So I used to have, the method used to be called ODRA, Observation, Deconstruction, Rehearsal, Assembly. Now it's called Observation, Deconstruction, Rehearsal, Assembly, Refinement, because I also believe you can always go back and refine something. I recently talked to this woman about, like, she said, well, when is your work? We talked about this idea of when the work is finished. And she said, I said, the work is finished with me when I sell the piece and it goes to the collector's house. Okay, that's when it's finished. Because she said, oh, that's not when it's finished for me. I've gone and I thought, oh my goodness, you've gone to the collector's house and you've changed it. She said, yeah, I've ruined a couple pieces that way. I said, oh, that's really interesting. But the point is that, but I always do leave the idea for refinement. But once it leaves my presence and it goes into, then I don't interfere with it anymore, because then it's not mine anymore. And the purpose of my work is also not for it to be mine. The purpose of my work is actually for it to go out in the world and become somebody else's story.
We have 3 questions in the chat. And the first two are first of all, how big are these collages, and what kind of surface do you glue onto?
Okay, so my preferred size, my most, like I'm a size medium in my clothes. My preferred size is 32 inches by 40 inches. So that's like the size that I think in. And I also like the landscape view, in other words, or landscape or portrait, but I like a rectangle, because I feel that, like, since a lot of what I'm doing is memorizing the world, we look at all these computer screens and all these, it's all a rectangle. So basically it's hard for me to work in a square. So I often work in a rectangle. And then the surfaces that I use is that I often glue it down onto a mat board that's called illustration board, but recently I've started to glue it down onto a wood panel. It depends on it depends on which works they are. So that everything from like a illustration board, which is like like a thick 8-ply mat board, to a wood panel.
Okay, and then we have another question. A question about your process. Are your selected images always intentional, based on collective memory, or sometimes incorporated for aesthetic desires?
Aesthetic desires is a big, that's why like today I was looking at this idea of like, what is beauty? And it's funny because in the philosophical ideas about what is beauty, it doesn't really actually define what beauty is, but aesthetic is a very important driver in my work. And I'm proud to say that. I think that aesthetics is but I don't believe that, that I believe that there's an aesthetic to sadness. In other words, I like sad songs, I like sad movies. My work tends to be happy, but I do actually do aesthetic desires are definitely part of the work. And I do also pay attention to things like, balance and color and focus and, and harmonies and, color stories and, elements of composition with guiding lines and framing lines. And, I do, sometimes I think of my work, sometimes I go and I look at the huge murals of like Tiepolo and all these, and, and I try to think about like, how can you look at that entire scene and it be one whole scene? Because there's so much stuff going on. But aesthetic desires definitely drives my process very, very much.
Okay, great. Do we have any final questions? We're just about ready to wrap up here. We have
I have a
lots of them.
question.
Yeah, let's go Fred first.
Yeah, your pieces on the right have all been very dimensional in appearance. You deal a lot with depth, perspective, yet the medium is very flat. I was curious if you have ever considered or even tried using actual three-dimensional objects in with your compositions.
That's interesting. So I do like the idea of a diorama, because I think that these would lend themselves pretty well to a diorama concept. I haven't completely figured that out yet, but I'm definitely open to it. And I do like the idea of assemblage. I like things that are put together in ways, where and I also like the idea of combining the two. In other words, that I might be able to combine, use this scene, for example, and put something three-dimensional in front of it to create even more depth. But that's a very interesting idea. So sort of, yes and no. I haven't figured it out yet, though.
Okay.
And Hank, you had a question.
He needs to unmute himself.
Betsy, I want to thank you for your question. Betsy Silverman is also another collage artist. She's on. Thank you very much for coming in. I really appreciate your question.
I just
Okay.
unmuted myself. That was an error. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I just had a thought in response to looking at your very complex and interesting images, and I can't cite the source of this, but I've heard about research. Maybe some of it focused on the role of eyewitnesses in criminal trials, about the fluidity of memory and how changeable memory is. That memory isn't necessarily a reflection of what really happened, because it is fluid and memories change over time. And I got into just thinking about getting that dimension into your work, and I started imagining your images being animated. And that's really all I had to say. It was a thought I wanted to share.
Thank you. Thank you. It's related. It's definitely related. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually, in our pre-interviews, we talked about the idea of witnessing and how it's not a very reliable thing, memory. Not in that way. Maybe memory isn't designed to do that,
Well, so I do believe that there's an observational bias, which basically means that we tend to observe things, but we're not necessarily always aware of what we're observing also. In other words, what we consciously can recall and what was deep in our memory is, it can be a little bit murky, but there's definitely an observational bias in the sense that and everybody has experienced that, when they say, well, if somebody asks, like, I would give you an example, just a funny example. You say, like, you're wearing basically, I don't know, like, I don't know, some kind of a funny hat, and you ask your spouse, like, how do I look? And they say, oh, you look fine. And they don't even notice you're wearing a funny hat. So that's an example of, like, the idea that we observe, in bits and pieces.
Well, I'm even aware of a situation personally where someone I know was an eyewitness to a crime, and the perpetrator got away, and it wasn't till years later that he was apprehended and brought to trial. And she was upset that she wasn't called as a witness. And the prosecutor told her that, well, your witness is valuable. You made your statement, but if we called you up as a witness, your memory of it wouldn't be exactly the statement that you gave to the police. And so that would be a crack that the defense attorney would take advantage of as to whether or not you really saw what you knew you saw.
So the purpose of, so I want to make clear that the purpose of it is not that we doubt necessarily our memories in general, but that the idea that, that certain parts of our memories obviously fade and other parts get, and the other idea is also that as we go through the course of life, we tend to look at things in the past in a different way. In other words, a layer from the future might make you look at something in the past. And I give the experience, like, where, to sort of change the focus a little bit, is that somebody might behave in a certain way toward you, or be dismissive and not talk to you necessarily. And then you might find out later on that they were, I don't know, they'd just been let go from their job. When you add that layer to the memory that they had just gotten let go from their job, you might remember the situation in which they were dismissive of you in a slightly different way, because the layer that came later actually recontextualized it. And then in life, basically, we're adding all these layers onto it. So basically, where does the memory start and where does the memory begin? And at what point do you make these cutoffs? In a photograph, we cut out the frame, but in our real lives, things get condensed, and that kind of a thing too.
And I think Julie, you had a question a little while ago.
Yes, I have a quick question. I'm curious, you get these from magazines. Are these magazines you buy? Do people give them to you? Are they ads? Do you have go-to magazines? Where do your materials come from?
So they're mostly ads. So they're mostly advertisements. So there's a whole layer, meaning in terms of advertisements and, like, the role that advertisements play in our lives. And I get them mostly, I would say maybe 95% of them are either given to me or come from the recycling room in my building. So, or they came from my office waiting room. I guess that would be considered, but they're all basically, but I don't actually go out and buy anything per se. And then in some ways, basically, when people because people will drop off tons of magazines, they just realize that, I say that once you identify yourself as a collage artist, people will give you materials. So then it becomes an extension of the people that and the periodicals that they read, so it's not necessarily by chance what it is that I come across. It actually has to do with, like, my reach.
Oh, well. And I believe Mandy had a question earlier as well.
Yeah, when someone else has your work and you said it becomes someone else's story, do you ever ask their interpretation of your story? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I haven't asked too often about their interpretation of the story. Sometimes they do volunteer it, but I also like the idea that becomes, I don't try to influence it too much, honestly. I try to really allow them to make their own story. I don't try to fill in the blanks and say, oh, that's that. If I do hear their story, I often just say, oh, I do like the idea that they relate to it in their own way and it becomes theirs. Yeah. That's a really interesting question.
That's great. And we have one final question from Hank.
Have you ever used art magazines as material where the things that you're cutting out are actually images that were created by other artists? And if you do, is that ethical?
I tend to stick pretty much to advertisements. And sort of like, yeah, I tend to stick to advertisements. I don't usually use, I don't think I've ever used an art magazine per se. Because also my work is also about the idea of, like, the role of media, or at least that branch of it has to do with the role of media in our lives and how we connect over like basically things that most of us are presented. And most of the stuff that I use are things that would be pretty omnipresent, you know, like that a lot of people would have seen. So more popular stuff.
Great. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Stephen. Your work is so interesting.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and for your wonderful questions. Always thought-provoking. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Gene.
All right.
You're welcome.
We'll see you back, everybody back next month with another art talk.
I have one announcement real quick. We have a call for entries called See Me, and you can find the information on the homepage at the bottom right-hand corner. It's dealing with self-portraits. So anyway, if you know people that you think would be good, let them know. Or if you have pieces, you know, go ahead and enter.
Thank you.
And Julie, if you could hang on for a minute too, I'd like to talk to you for a second too.